Hello everyone and welcome to the Distinct Mastering YouTube channel. My name is Freddie. Today we're going to be doing something slightly different. I'm going to be talking about how to get the perfect reverbs in your track. The first half of this video is going to be a bit of concepts and just discussion face to face. And the second half, I'm going to show you some examples. I'm also soft launching my memberships for 2025 this week, so you can sign up to get an exclusive bonus only content to this video, a whole new video of me showing how I apply reverbs to a remix of mine that I'm working on, and just getting into the nitty gritty and having a further blown discussion about reverbs. So if you're interested, check out the memberships tab, and then more details on the full memberships that I'm offering next week. Now, if you like the track that's playing in the background, it's a new one of mine. It's out on Nos Recordings, our label, and it's by Erick, Diaz, my alias Freshcobar, and Lavelle Dupree, and it's called You Gots To. Links to all that down below. Now let's get into the video and talk about reverbs. Reverb can make or break your mix, but how do you choose the right one for your sounds or your songs? Well, there's lots of options, and we're going to get into some basic guidelines that you can follow. But before you just go and slap on that plugin, I want to put some concepts in your head, and that is why we're going to have a discussion. Reverbs are important to create depth and space in your productions. If you want everything dry up front in your face that just slaps at you, then you may not use reverb. But even if you have a full production that's almost completely dry, having reverb on one or two sounds can really still change the game. But it's all about selecting the right one. So we're going to talk about some core concepts and things you should think about first before you pick your plugin. So just to make it clear, reverb is basically a simulation of sound. When you're in a large room or a cathedral, a hall, if you clap and you hear that reverberation, that is what artificial reverb, like we use in music production, is trying to emulate. Not everybody has the ability to slap a microphone in this huge room and play your drums or whatever you want to do. Although that's been common in some old 70s and different recordings from the past, we just don't have that luxury, and hence we try to use artificial reverb. So before you apply your reverb, you need to think about a few things and core concepts of what you're trying to get the listener to hear. The four key factors you need to consider before selecting your reverb is, number one, the sound source. What is the sound source that you are about to apply reverb to? Is it a vocal? Is it an instrument? What kind of instrument? Is it a drum? All of these different instruments and textures are going to give you different decision-making processes when selecting the reverb. The second thing you need to consider when applying a reverb is, how big of a space do you want to put the listener in? What is the sense of space you're trying to place into your production? Are you trying to put the listener in a tight room, a hall, big hall, very large hall, cathedral? All of these things are going to have a play in how that reverb gives you character. Is the room made out of wood? Is it made out of concrete? You know, think about those things. Third thing you want to think about is the desired character of the reverb. Is it bright? Is it dull? Is it spacious? Does it decay for a long time? Have a big tail? Is it very short and snappy? All of that is going to also dictate what reverb you might apply. And the fourth thing you want to think about is the genre or vibe that you're kind of aiming for. You know, if you're going to go something more vintage, you might go towards more of a spring reverb. If you want something a little bit more pop oriented, you might go for more halls and plates. So genre can dictate the typical type of reverb, but remember, there are no rules. So I want to talk about 5 reverb types, and I discussed this in a past video. I'm going to leave you a link to that down below. I give tons of examples of using reverb in that video. In this video, we're going to talk about concepts. So the first type of reverb you typically see is a room reverb. Room reverbs are good for small to medium-sized spaces, and they give you a very intimate sound. So if you're looking to put the listener up front and close, stay to the center of the stage and the stage you're creating in your mix, room reverb is a really good option. It gives the listener a very up front, close and center, personal vibe. Okay, the next type of reverb you commonly see is a hall reverb. And halls can be good for very large atmospheric sounds, to create a very large sense of space. Halls can be good for orchestral instruments, very dramatic effects, you know, huge tails if you want to do like a reverb tail or some type of spray reverb where you want something to kind of spray out. Halls are a very good choice for that option. So if you want to put the listener in a space that's fairly vast and large, go for a hall reverb. Plate reverbs are one of my favorites. They're very bright, shimmery. They can help whatever you put a plate reverb on cut through the mix. They're very common on vocals. I always use a plate reverb on vocals. It's just something that I love to do. And what I like to do is select the right plate on vocals just to give it that extra edge. You almost don't know it's there, but when you mute it, it's like, wow. Now, that's kind of the trick with reverb. I'm not saying that you can only use plate on vocals. You can use plate on whatever you want. It's just something that I personally like to do. So just think of plate reverb as something like a knife that's going to help you cut through the mix. Spring reverbs are cool. They're very common on guitars and instruments. They can give you a very big vintage vibe. So if you want to go for something a little bit more old school or just to give something a lot of flavor, go for a spring reverb. Try it. And then another type of reverb is chamber. And chamber is great for acoustic instruments. It gives a vast sense of kind of bigger space than a room. And it's just another one that's not as commonly used and not as commonly discussed, but one that I recommend you check out. So before we get into examples of using reverbs and how I've used reverb, I want to get into some other context. But remember, I made you a special members only video that's totally different from this one, showing one of my newest remixes that's not out yet and how I went about selecting the reverbs and going into more depth about why I made the choices I made. So if you're interested, head over to the membership tab, check that out. Full details on the membership is coming next week, and I have some very exciting stuff for you guys. So if you're a house music producer like me, dance music producer, some of the more common reverbs are going to be obviously plates, rooms, and halls. I suggest you try a mix of them. Having nice halls for spray reverbs and creating those big dramatic builds is very key. I love plates for vocals. However, I do like rooms and halls for instruments. I also like plates on drums. You know, there's some great drum plates you can use to help drums cut through the mix. And remember, you can also put a reverb on a lot of your drums to glue them together, put the drums in a space. And you might use like a room or a hall to put something else, put the whole track in a space. You know, the possibilities are really endless, and mixing reverbs can get fun. Now, in pop music, it is very common to blend rooms and halls for a very polished sound, and that kind of gives you that sense of sheen. So that's another genre-specific trick for you. Jazz, a cool trick to do with reverbs if you're making some jazz or just like acoustic stuff, is try some chambers. Chamber reverbs can be fun, and it's kind of not one of the normal go-tos that people talk about, but for that vintage acoustic vibe, chamber reverb might be your best friend. Just a couple tips before we get into some examples. If you're going to use reverb, make sure you tailor your decay time to what you're doing. If your decay time requires you to have a short decay and you want it short and snappy, make sure it's short. Tip for you with drums is to make sure the decay time is shrunk down so that the reverb ends before the next drum hit. It's going to really keep your drums tight. Otherwise, you're just going to create a huge sense of mud. Another good tip for you is to use an EQ after your reverb to roll off lows or potentially some highs to dampen the reverb. Now, the reverb might have a dampen control, which can also give you that effect, but I like to tailor the reverb and get rid of the mud in the low end and then maybe adjust the high end or just tap it down a little if it's too much, if it gets a little too brittle. Something to consider EQing your reverbs. And the last tip I have for you before we get into some examples is to truly make sure you blend your reverb with the track. A lot of beginners use way too much reverb and they just think that soaking everything in reverb helps, but in reality, it can create a big mess. So spend a little time learning your reverbs, finding the right ones. I suggest you pick 1 or 2, maybe 3 reverb plugins and really get to know them in and out. Another thing is try to put the reverb on a send and return instead of just putting it on the track. Unless you're trying to do like a sound design, I don't recommend that. But make sure the reverb is enhancing and not overpowering. Okay, now I'm going to show you some examples of a track that I recently finished up. It's not the mastered version, obviously. I'm in the mixing session, but I'm going to give you some examples of some key reverbs that I used in this one track. And remember, if you want more, check out the members only section. Let's get into my session and talk about picking the perfect reverbs. Okay, this is a track that I just recently finished up. The mastering's done. Excited to share it with you in 2025. But you're getting a sneak peek now. And I want to talk about 3 key reverbs that I used in this track. One is a plate on the vocal. It's subtle, but it matters. 2, I used a small hall on the instruments. And once again, it's subtle, but it just adds warmth, character, vibe, and it helps bring it up in the mix. And 3, I'm going to show you an example of using a super long reverb as a sound design technique, otherwise known as a spray reverb, which is common in dance music, and how you can use that. And I implore you to explore some spring reverbs and chamber reverbs. I play with some spring reverb in my Galaxy Tape Echo video. I'll leave you a link to that. And I play with lots of different reverbs in a couple of my reverb videos. All of the links are down below. Now let's get into selecting some reverbs. Okay, so first I'm going to show you the vocal. Just for context, I'm going to play you a little bit of the track. So this just builds and builds and builds, and then it finally drops. And as you can see, we've got a lot of effects here. We've got a little bit of the small hall. And if you don't know how to use send and returns, I've got a video on that. I'll leave you a link to that down below. And we've got some delays, and then I have a vocal plate. So here in this track, I'm actually mixing reverbs together. So let's go ahead and play the vocal dry. And here is the vocal plate. There it is at full volume. I'll play it. There it is at full send. I'm going to play this for you. Doesn't sound good like that, but it's giving you the tone. So watch as I back this off. So that's where it was. Now it's bypassed, and I'm going to turn it on, so watch the send mute down below here. Do you hear how it helps cut through the mix? It just really emphasizes the vocal. It gives it a nice texture. And you barely notice it. You don't really know it's there. That's the key sometimes to dialing in your reverbs. Okay, the other thing I removed was the hall, and the hall was put in place to give everything a sense of room, space, like putting everything in one spot, one room. So check it out. It's muted. Now that just turned the hall on for this instrument bus and these vocals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this down on the instrument bus. It was minus 14. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this down and bring it up to 9.7. So if you notice, what it did is it actually buried the vocal slightly, ever so slightly into the mix, and it gave everything a sense of space. Now, when I add the instruments back in, and you can hear how small that is. Very small, very light. So to close out with the mixing of the reverbs, once again, that's a very common pop trick, and I do it a lot. I'll have, you know, a reverb, a plate maybe on the vocal, and then I'll put everything in a sense of a room. Sometimes I don't do that. It really depends on the vibe I'm going for. You got to get creative, and that's why really getting to know a couple of reverb units is going to be your best friend versus trying all these reverbs under the sun. Okay, last but not least, I want to show you another cool type of reverb, and this is where you're using reverb as a sound design technique, commonly known as a spray reverb. Now, there's lots of ways to accomplish this, but really what you're going for is you're just going for a very cool reverb with a long tail. So I just used the Ableton one here, and I have a long decay. I took out some low end on the diffusion, and then as you see here, as I spoke about, I have an EQ taking off some top and some bottom, and I have a send here from a send and return on this spray, so it's actually on the leads, and that's all it's doing. giving you that nice tail. Now listen. Provides a nice texture. Let's play this without it. It just doesn't drop the same. So that's some cool techniques on how you can use reverb in your tracks. Don't forget about the members only content if you want to learn more and get in depth with me on selecting reverbs on one of the remixes that I recently just finished up. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Freddie from Distinct Mastering. If you really enjoyed this kind of video, these concept videos, please drop me a comment down below and I will make you some more. I've got a lot of concepts that I can discuss. And I feel like a lot of people on YouTube are just teaching and showing you how to do things and not actually talking about the concepts. The concepts are what really make you think and really can help you apply some new techniques to your music productions if you really think about it, what you're doing, what you're trying to do before just acting. Now remember, I have a whole new members only section of the channel I'm launching. Full announcement next week, but I do have one exclusive video, members only, on selecting the perfect reverbs. That's totally different. Goes in depth on how I chose some of the reverbs in a recent production of mine. So if you're interested, head over to the membership tab and check that out. And remember, if you like the track that's playing down below, links to that as well. My name is Freddie from Distinct Mastering. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and the bell notification will keep you up to date. And until then, I will catch you on the next one. Peace.